Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, you may notice things look a little different, and this was really awesome. Andrea reached out to me on Discord, sent this kind of frame to me, which I think looks fantastic, and said, hey, see what you think of this, and let me know if you have any tweaks, any ideas. So I thought I'd try it out today for this reaction video. You guys let me know what you think. Is there anything maybe we can tweak to make it a little more user-friendly, to make it more or less, what you think it should be? So let us know in the comment section below what you think of this frame that we're using for the videos. I think it looks great. I didn't even ask for it, but Andrea, great job. Appreciate you reaching out. Just one more reason why our community is so fantastic on this channel. Also want to say thank you to the folks who have donated in the GoFundMe toward my travel expenses. We went over the amount that our mods on Discord set. You can still donate to that if you so choose, if that's the way you want to support this channel. Also, supporting through Patreon. All of the funds raised through Patreon go directly to my travel fund to help me to be able to make original content from historic sites, and there's a lot of that coming soon. So I got a lot of messages, a lot of comments from people saying, hey, Checkmate Lincolnites has a new video, you got to check it out. So here we are. I promise we're going to get back to the Caesar series, but we keep getting distracted with Civil War content. So we're going to check this out. Haven't watched it. I believe it's brand new today, and it's a 50-minute video, so I'm probably going to break this reaction up into 2 parts. We'll do part 1 today, do part 1 tomorrow before I head to Boston. But this is, did the Confederacy have better generals? So I'm curious to see what he has to say. Let's get right into it.
Checkmate. What? No. There must be somewhere old Jeff Davis can go. Nope. Might as well change his name to Norman C. Francis, because he is done. What? Never mind. Just some local humor.
Yeah, I don't get it either.
How long that game go on for? 7 months. Well, this is ridiculous. I never stood a chance. You were fighting with one hand tied behind your back. What with all your industry and naval power and some such. Naval power? What board game were you playing? But I think we both know who were the finer soldiers. The men of the South. Never before, in all the annals of military history, were there a finer collection of officers at war than those of the Confederate States are.
And that is the common thing that is said, right? That, the South had the better generals. They were fighting on their home turf, so those were their advantages. But of course, the North had the industrial might, the manpower, the resources, the materials. That's kind of usually how it's framed as far as as the Civil War goes.
Lee, Jackson, Forrest, Longstreet. We don't talk about him.
And what he means by that is, we've talked about this on the channel, James Longstreet kind of became a pariah in the South after the war because he became a Republican, which was the party of Lincoln and Grant, and the party that prosecuted the war, basically. And so he became a Republican, served in a Republican administration as the minister to Turkey. By and large was kind of persona non grata in the South after the war, and so he waited until a lot of his political outspoken opponents died, and late in his life, he died in 1904. Late in his life, he wrote an autobiography to kind of tell his side of the story.
Early Beauregard, Mosby, and I'm sure there were some other ones too. Oh, the names of these men ring down through the generations as men of action, great masters of the art of war. If they were so good, why didn't they win? Checkmate, Davis Sights. I'm sorry, Billy, but it simply does not have quite the same ring to it as Checkmate, Lincolnites! The program where we obliterate the righteous cause myth, a disgusting Yankee lie which dares to suggest that the sultry, balmy, beautiful South seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery.
So, I can't help when he says the sultry, balmy South, but think of that just excruciatingly painful part of Gods and Generals where the actor that plays Sandy Pendleton, who just one of the many casting choices that I wish hadn't happened in that movie. They're drinking lemonade he's drinking lemonade with Stonewall Jackson, and he says that here's to the sultry, balmy South. And just, I hate that part.
Could you imagine such a thing? Tonight we shall prove once and for all the uncontested martial superiority of the Confederate soldier upon the field of battle. That's right, folks. The best generals were Southern. The Yankees won for a couple of reasons. They had more money and manpower. Given time, any fool can win a war of attrition.
That was part of it, sure, but don't you think you're overstating the case?
Nope. No, sir. We were doomed from the start, and we only held on for as long as we did because our brave boys fought like wildcats. In battle, one of us was worth 10 of you effete urban Yankees. And
So, before he even gets into his argument, which I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I will say, I'll give a couple of my own thoughts before he gets into it, and then I'll kind of respond to what he says. I think that Lee, for example, is probably overblown a little bit as far as his ability. He was fighting against some pretty incompetent commanders on the Union, especially early in the war. Jackson also, I think, probably gets oversold as a great general, in part because he died. And a lot of times when people die in the middle of something, they get romanticized as being greater than they really were. Jackson had some pretty miserable failures, particularly at the 7 Days battles, where he did pretty bad, coming off of his victories in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, out west, the story's not the same. I mean, there were some pretty incompetent Confederate commanders in the West, so I'll be curious to see what he says about all this.
Immigrant hordes, not to mention our ingenious commanders, who held on against the Abolition Army for longer than was thought possible, until after 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, we were compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources.
Oh, I see what you're doing there. You're quoting Lee's farewell address after his surrender at Appomattox. You know, it's interesting because with the very verbiage of that address, Lee abrogates his own personal responsibility for defeat. It was all just overwhelming numbers and resources. No other reason. Certainly not Confederate mismanagement or the competency and skill of the United States Army. I mean, no. That would be crazy.
Well, now
I will say this. Prior to 1864... Lee had held his own pretty well against that overwhelming manpower and resources. It's not like suddenly the Union had overwhelming manpower and resources. They had that from the start. Now, granted, as you get into 64, 65, the Confederacy starts running out of those things. They also have a serious issue financially when it comes to inflation and the buildup of the pressure from the Union blockade, which is going to compound as time goes on, just like the blockade did, say, in World War I of German ports. As time goes on, those blockades become more and more of an issue. So it did compound as time went on. But, you know, the Union always had that advantage. I just think Lee finally went up against a general in Grant who recognized the advantage they had and took advantage of it.
I think you've really lost it. The North's industrial capacity was massive. See this photograph? This is the shipyard of one William Webb in the East River and Manhattan. This ironclad under construction is state-of-the-art, over 300 feet long, more than a match for any Confederate warship then in use. However, this behemoth would never face the Confederate Navy, for it was commissioned by the Italian Navy and would see service in the Battle of Lissa against Austria-Hungary in 1866. See, the North's industrial capacity was so humongous that it could not only more than provide for its own military, but for the militaries of other nations as well.
That's actually a really interesting tidbit. But, you know, God isn't always on the side of the biggest battalions. History is full of wars where the side with the lower population and fewer resources won.
True.
You know, the Haitian Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Winter War, the list goes on. Hell, I think you guys had a better chance of beating us in the Civil War than we had of beating the British in the Revolutionary War.
And, of course, the difference, there's a lot of parallels between the Confederacy and the Revolutionary War in terms of the conditions necessary for victory. The American Revolution was never going to be successful on its own. They basically needed foreign money and intervention, and in this case it was France and Spain, primarily France, but also Spain. So those things had to happen, but it also was not a situation where the United States was going to win on the battlefield by defeating the British army. They had to outlast the British populace until the British government finally realized that it was getting too expensive and too costly in terms of manpower to continue, and they finally lose the will to fight. That's what needed to happen in the Civil War. The Confederacy needed those same set of circumstances. They needed intervention by foreign powers, support from those foreign powers, and then also for the Union to give up wanting to fight.
And once or twice, he almost did.
Yes. If only Jackson had survived his grievous wound at Chancellorsville and went on to carry the day on July 1st at Culp's Hill. If only the Yankees had not found General Order 191 during the Maryland campaign, then old Moss Robert would have whooped Little Mac for sure. If only the British had joined us in the fight.
That was never
happening. And the great
happening.
army of red and gray went a-marching all the way to Washington.
The British were never going to join on the side of the Confederacy. They might have supported them financially. They might have opened up trade. They were never going to send an army. They were never going to send a bunch of resources, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation turned it into a war about freeing the slaves. The Confederacy was done at that point with any hope of getting help.
If only Sherman would have spontaneously combusted at the Battle of Chattanooga, then Atlanta never would have fallen. If only we could have cloned Jeb Stuart so he could be in both the Western and the Eastern theaters at the same time, that would have shown.
Well, in the West they had Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was every bit as competent a cavalry commander as Jeb Stuart was.
The Federals a thing or two. If only Judah P. Benjamin had unleashed the power of the Ark of the Covenant, melting the faces off of all those.
So Judah Benjamin was a part of the Confederate government, and he was Jewish. So it seems like maybe going a little bit far there.
Yankee scoundrels.
I'd like to formally apologize for what he just said about Judah P. Benjamin.
The world, we surely would have won the war then.
Circling back,
Yeah.
history has shown that a large industrial capacity doesn't always correlate with a nation's ability or willingness to make war.
Fair.
Lest we forget, there was substantial anti-war sentiment in the North throughout the Civil War, especially in the summer of '64, when the public perceived that the war was going extremely badly for the United States.
I don't know if I completely agree with that, because by '64, Vicksburg had fallen. The Union was marching on Atlanta. And of course, I mean, there was the casualty figures coming out of Grant's overland campaign were pretty brutal. And yeah, there was certainly an anti-war sentiment, but I don't know that it was any worse in '64 than it had been in the first 3 years before that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Keep in mind, this was after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, when the tide supposedly turned against the rebels. Now, of course, in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh, well, the Confederacy was doomed at that point, but for people at the time, it was far from certain. During the grueling sieges of Petersburg and Atlanta, there was a tremendous amount of public pressure on President Lincoln to enter into peace negotiations with the Confederacy.
There was that pressure, especially from the Democrats, but again, I don't know that it was that strong. It was there, and there was certainly a significant portion of people, but I don't know that it was even a majority of the population.
It was only after Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's scourging of the Shenandoah in '64 that the public began to regain hope that the war could be won. If the presidential election of 1864 had been held in August instead of November, then Lincoln probably would have lost and George McClellan would have become president. And if his timid conduct as commanding general of the army is any indication of how he would have conducted the war as president, I think it's pretty safe to say he would have given the rebels ample opportunity to bounce back.
And I don't know if I agree with that either. I think it would have been a closer election. It was a landslide for Lincoln in November. I don't know that public perception of the war changed so much that it went from being a McClellan victory to a Lincoln victory, an overwhelming Lincoln victory. But let's say that it did. Let's say for a second that McClellan wins in November '64. Number one, McClellan, unlike his party, the Democratic Party as a platform had a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. But McClellan personally did not. And the other thing with that is that McClellan would not have become president until March of 65. By that point, the war was over. I mean, the only thing that they were waiting on was for the weather to get good enough for Grant to finish Lee off. But Sherman by that point is marching into the Carolinas, and the war was over in March of 1865. It just hadn't been finished yet. I don't think McClellan's election would have changed that.
Timid, yes. On that we can agree. A fine administrator.
Not such a great field commander.
Oh, I was half expecting you to defend McClellan and proclaim him as some sort of military mastermind. But not even you would stoop so low. How's that humble pie taste, Billy?
It's a little dry.
Well, you conceded a point, so I shall graciously return the favor. Perhaps I did exaggerate the role of industry in federal victory. However, if industry didn't do it, then the Yankee tendency toward tyranny certainly did. In the 20s and 30s, historian Frank L. Owsley argued that the Confederacy had, quote, died of states' rights. Our commitment to freedom was too great, that our states could not coordinate under a strong central power.
Now, I will concede that. I don't think it made a difference in the outcome of the war, but that was a major issue. And Jefferson Davis argued that point, that if he had the power that Lincoln did, he could have prosecuted the war differently. He constantly dealt with governors that were, fighting with him over the whole states' rights issue, which is interesting because the argument being that the Confederacy was all about states' rights, but then turned around and had states' rights be an issue for them. It's kind of funny that then they wanted to have a strong central government.
And it hamstrung our war effort. What are your thoughts?
Owsley's full of shit. First off, his entire premise is a fiction. I mean, sure, Davis clashed with governors over stuff like troop allocations for local defense, but these were outlying events, the importance of which he greatly exaggerated. But more importantly, I just don't buy that the Confederacy's internal divisions were responsible for its defeat.
No, I agree with that. I think he's underselling the internal divisions a little bit. I think they were a bigger issue than he's letting on. But I agree that it wasn't significant enough that it changed the outcome of the war. Totally agree with that.
The North had to deal with internal division that was just as, if not more intense than anything the South had to deal with. I mean, you take the 1863 draft riots, for instance, or the intense pressure on the Lincoln administration throughout the war for swift and spectacular battlefield victories.
I don't know if that pressure was on the Lincoln administration. I think Lincoln put that pressure on his generals, and I think sometimes that was a problem. I think Lincoln's pressure on his generals sometimes caused those generals to make mistakes they might not have otherwise made. Now, with McClellan, he absolutely needed to put that pressure on. But like with Burnside, I think Burnside made mistakes that he would not have made if there hadn't been so much pressure by the Lincoln administration. I think Lincoln sometimes got too involved in what his generals were doing. But now the draft riots and things like that, the difference is that Lincoln dealt with those things swiftly and strongly. He dealt with things like what was happening in Maryland with martial law and with suspending habeas corpus. Lincoln did a lot to kind of bend the Constitution to deal with those issues in ways that I don't know that Jefferson Davis could or would.
Or the political polarization that followed the Emancipation Proclamation. Talk about hamstringing the war effort. No, any way you slice it, the Confederacy lost the Civil War on the field of battle. The Lincoln administration outmaneuvered them politically, and the boys in blue annihilated them militarily. Sometimes when you start a bar fight, you end up on the floor. It happens.
I notice a hero worship of the Northern generals and seething hatred of the Southern generals from our SGW historian. Why am I not surprised? He's looking for a narrative to sell instead of facts.
Why don't we break it down? What's so great about all these Secesh generals? Go ahead, Johnny, ball's in your court.
I'll start strong, shall I? Thomas J. Jackson. He expelled the Yankees from the Shenandoah Valley in a near-flawless campaign of maneuver and decisively flanked Hooker's 11th Corps, Chancellorsville.
He also froze during the 7 Days battles when his lack of coordination with Lee and Longstreet caused horrifying numbers of unnecessary Confederate casualties.
Also got lost a few times during the 7 days. He is 100% right about that. People completely ignore how poorly Stonewall Jackson did in the 7 days because they love to talk about what happened before that and after that. He's right.
Look, I like Jackson. But I think his death was probably the best thing that could have happened to his reputation.
Agree.
He would have fallen from grace eventually. It
Agree.
was inevitable. I mean, could you imagine him fighting in the defensive grind of the Overland Campaign or the grueling trench warfare of Petersburg? His brilliance as an aggressive general was unmatched, but in many ways he was kind of a one-trick pony. And I think a compelling argument could be made that Jackson's offensive tactics ultimately did more harm than good.
And you know what? Honestly, you can even look at some of the places where he fought on the defensive and didn't necessarily perform as well. For example, Fredericksburg. His line was broken at Fredericksburg, and it was only the utter incompetence of the Union generals on the Union left to not reinforce Meade's breakthrough with Meade's division that saved the day for Jackson. But Jackson got broken at Fredericksburg. He got broken on the left at Antietam. When he had to fight defensively and didn't get to use his strategy and spring, a bold maneuver on somebody, he's right.
Take Chancellorsville, for example. Sure, he won a flashy tactical victory that fills the pants of military history nerds with buckets of jizz, but what did he actually accomplish in the grand scheme of things?
He smashed the 11th Corps of the Union Army.
Okay, and he got a lot of his own troops killed. Troops that Lee could not afford to lose.
Yep.
Time and again, throughout the war, rebel generals tried to one-shot Union armies with dramatic Jacksonian offenses. Sure, they might maul a corps and gain a victory, but the Yankees always came back. They never realized that gambling everything on one climactic, decisive, war-winning battle was just a plain bad bet, and it always cost the Rebs more than they gained.
Nitpicks, I say. You're finding fault where there is none. Stonewall Jackson was a mighty war chief, whereas the Union High Command, it was a veritable menagerie of nincompoops. Burnside, Pope, Butler, Banks, Meade.
Don't you dare talk shit about George Gordon Meade.
And I'm with him on this. I think very highly of George Gordon Meade as a general.
Oh, what? You'll scurry up to the top of a hill and wait for me to come charging after? Please, don't take much brains to defend high ground with superior numbers. The only reason we did not carry the field at Gettysburg was because of that scallywag Longstreet, dragging his heels instead of launching his crucial offensive in concert with Wohl and Ewell's corps.
Yeah, but look at Ewell. If you look at the Battle of Gettysburg, Ewell's attack on Culp's Hill still did not go off until long after Longstreet had. So I don't buy that argument that Longstreet drug his feet and cost them the coordination with Ewell, because it still didn't coordinate right. And Longstreet drug his feet because it was a bad attack. If you go there and visit the ground, it's a horrible place to attack. It was stupidity by Lee to order that attack. I don't blame Longstreet for dragging his feet.
And then, once we retreated, that old snapping turtle Meade did nothing to pursue us, instead allowing us to return to Virginia unmolested, a fact that vexed Abraham Lincoln to no end. As the tyrant himself said,
"You fought and beat the enemy at Gettysburg, and of course, to say the least, his loss was as great as yours. He retreated, and you did not, as it seemed to me, pressingly pursue him. But a flood in the river detained him, till by slow degrees you were again upon him. You had at least 20,000 veteran troops directly with you, and as many more raw ones within supporting distance, all in addition to those who fought with you at Gettysburg."
See, I love Abraham Lincoln, and I think he was one of our greatest presidents, but I've got real issues with how he handled some of his generals and how much he meddled in what was going on. And if you understand that Meade had only been in command of the Army of the Potomac for 3 days when the Battle of Gettysburg started. I mean, he had just taken command of that army after Hooker resigned just a couple of days earlier. And then he suffers a third casualties in the bloodiest battle in American history at that point. It's an understandable thing for him to have been a little slow in pursuing Lee.
"While it was not possible that he had received a single recruit, and yet you stood and let the flood run down, bridges be built, and the enemy move away at his leisure without attacking him. My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. If you could not safely attack Lee last Monday, how can you possibly do so south of the river, when you can take with you very few more than 2/3 of the force you then had in hand? Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it.
Ah, yes, he wrote that letter to Meade but never sent it, because he realized that no good could come from chastising him after the fact. God, Lincoln was so fucking classy. But you know, I think his criticism here was actually pretty unfair. What everybody seems to forget is that right after Gettysburg, Meade was under orders to keep his army between Lee and Washington, D.C. at all times. If he had just gone charging after the retreating Confederates, he would have been acting in violation of those orders. Also, his army had just won the biggest battle fought on North American soil. That's definitely a consideration.
And as you always hear me say, how do you define biggest battle? Most casualties, yes. Most men involved in a fight, no. Gettysburg's like fourth. Fredericksburg was the biggest battle. I think Chancellorsville was even bigger. There were, about 160,000 men involved at Gettysburg. Not the biggest battle fought in North America.
They'd lost a full quarter of their combat strength, and high casualties among high-ranking officers had effectively decapitated the Army's leadership.
Agree.
It was also pissing rain that whole week, making all military operations more challenging. And while the Army of Northern Virginia was waiting for the swollen waters of the Potomac River to recede enough to ford, they dug entrenchments and threw up earthworks. They wanted Meade to attack them there.
This beer used to be called Dixie.
Meade was no Jackson, right? He never attacked without good intelligence and solid knowledge of his enemy's dispositions. Was he a military genius? No. Did he make mistakes? Yeah, of course. But as far as I'm concerned, in the Gettysburg campaign, he did pretty much everything right.
Yep.
Lee didn't lose that battle. George Meade won it.
Very well, then. I propose we shift our focus to the Western theater.
Oh boy, here we go.
You sure you want to do that, Johnny?
I do.
You sure you want to do that? That's right. It doesn't get any better for you talking about Confederate generals if you go out west. At least not at the Army command level.
Prepare to quake in your boots, Billy Yank, and allow me to present the most daring cavalry commander of the war. You know him. You love him.
Forrest.
It's Nathan Bedford Forrest. Woo! Woo!
There's that god-awful statue. I don't even know where it is, but I see pictures of it all the time.
Nathan Bedford Forrest, right. Slave trader, clan leader.
Repentant clan leader.
Oh, well, that's okay then.
The South.
Oh, well, that's okay then. It is fair to point out the fact that he did repudiate the Klan, and he did back way off of their activity after a while. That doesn't justify. I'm not going to at all defend Nathan Bedford Forrest as a human being, but to give a complete picture, he did turn away from them.
The greatest cavalry officer was indeed appointed first leader of the KKK. He tried his best to keep it an honorable organization. Robert E. Lee had been offered the job first, but feeling that it would violate his parole and feeling that a younger man was needed, suggested Forrest.
The Klan was never an honorable organization.
Nope.
It was founded explicitly to terrorize black people and deprive them of their rights as American citizens.
Yep.
Now, Forrest worked hard to keep his association with the Klan secret, but it's not all that hard to piece everything together. In 1871, he was actually called to testify before Congress as part of an investigation into the Klan's terroristic activities.
And this is where I think people really don't give Grant enough credit as president. People talk about Grant's presidency as a colossal failure because of the corruption by people in his administration that he wasn't aware of, and he was kind of naive and got taken advantage of. But Grant did some incredible things when it came to civil rights, especially in creating the Justice Department to help put down the Klan. He pretty much destroyed the Klan as an organization, at least for that time period. And we're going to do some videos on Reconstruction at some point, because Reconstruction is one of the most shameful periods in American history. What happened to the former slaves in those years following the Civil War, I don't think enough people know about just how brutal and the murders that took place and the oppression and the terrorism that was done toward freed black people. It's one of the most shameful periods in our history for sure.
Here's what he had to say when Vermont Congressman Luke P. Poland asked him point blank if he was part of the Invisible Empire.
Are you a member of the Ku Klux, General? I'm not, but I am in sympathy and will cooperate with them. I know they are charged with many crimes that they are not guilty of. What do you think of Negro suffrage? I am opposed to it under any and all circumstances, and in our convention urged our party not to commit themselves at all upon the subject. If the Negroes vote to enfranchise us, I do not think I would favor their disfranchisement. We will stand by those who help us, and I want you to understand distinctly that I am not an enemy to the Negro. We want him here among us. He is the only laboring class we have, and
We want black people here because they're the only people that will do those jobs, is basically what he's saying.
more than that, I would sooner trust him than the white scalawag or carpetbagger.
So carpetbaggers, if you're not familiar, these are what happens is a lot of in the aftermath during Reconstruction, you have a lot of white Northerners who go south to get elected to positions, like, you know, people like Adelbert Ames, who becomes a senator and a governor of Mississippi, even though he's from Maine. So there's a lot of these people who go south and kind of take over everything as part of Reconstruction. And one of the things that happens, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but one of the things that happens during Reconstruction is that basically slavery comes back in all but name. Because a lot of these people, because they weren't supported by the Johnson administration, a lot of these former slaves had nowhere to go, had no place to work, no place to live. And so a lot of the former plantation owners would offer them jobs where basically the job was, you have to sign yourself over to me as a servant for a contract for, let's say, 2 years. I will feed you, I will house you, but I'm not going to pay you anything. And you're bound to me. So, like, if you try, you can't quit. I could go to court and get the courts and the police to force you to come back if you decide to quit or go somewhere else. And so it was basically slavery in all but name.
When I entered the army, I took 47 Negroes into the army with me, and 45 of them were surrendered with me. I said to them at the start, this fight is against slavery. If we lose it, you will be made free. If we whip the fight, you stay with me and be good boys. I will set you free. In either case, you will be free. These boys stayed with me, drove my teams, and better Confederates did not live.
Interesting.
Black Confederates! Black Confederates!
Oh.
They were Teamsters. Don't get excited. Come on, we've been over this.
Do you think the Ku Klux will try to intimidate the Negroes at the election?
Yeah.
I do not think they
You
will.
liar. Yes, they
However, a
will.
black man named Andrew J. Flowers from Chattanooga also testified at the hearing, and he painted a very different picture of the Klan's activities in Tennessee.
Do you now hold some office?
Yes, sir. I am a justice of the peace.
When were you chosen Justice of the Peace?
I was elected on the 4th of late August.
Justices of the Peace in Tennessee elected by a vote of the people?
Yes, sir. I was elected by a vote of the people.
I want to inquire of you, particularly in reference to some violence, which it has been understood was committed upon you a short time ago. Tell us the story in reference to that.
On the 18th, between 11 and 12, or 10 and 11 o'clock, I cannot say exactly which, I woke up and there was a crowd of men, all with masks around me, with pistols in their hands. They waked me up. They called me by my name. They took me out near a mile from the house.
Tell all that they said.
They asked me what was my name. I told them. And some of them said, "Oh yes, you are the man we are looking for," and so forth. One of them told me they were gonna kill me. He had a pistol in his hand. After they got me outdoors, the captain of the organization, they called him Captain, told me that he was going to whip me. Said he would give me 25 lashes. That I had the impudence to run against a white man for office and beat him. That they were not going to allow it.
Disgusting.
That it was an organization organized by them to stop Negroes holding office. And if they did not get out of office by being told or notified or whipped, they were going to kill them.
And this happened over and over and over again in the South by anybody who tried to exercise the rights, his constitutional rights, to be able to vote, for example. The intimidation and the beatings and the murders that took place just for people trying to vote. This is a story that was repeated throughout the South.
They took me up about a mile from the house. They hit me as many as 25 times.
Did they take you into a woods or a swamp?
They took me through the woods into an old field, down near a swamp. I had never been there before. They took off my coat and whipped me with hickories 7 or 8 feet long. They said they were going to give me 25 lashes, and I guess they gave it to me. They told me that if I would promise to resign my office when I went to Chattanooga next morning, they would turn me loose. And I very readily promised it.
They required you to promise to resign your office.
Yes, sir.
Flowers went on to describe how the Klan was using intimidation and violence to keep black men from voting, along with many other acts of domestic terrorism that Nathan Bedford Forrest not only aided and abetted, but more than likely orchestrated.
Oh, you are dastardly Billy Yankin besmirching General Forrest, so you know as well as I that in 1875 he gave a speech to a black civics organization in Memphis
He did.
in which he said,
We have but one flag, one country. Let us stand together. We may differ in color, but not in sentiment. Many things have been said about me which are wrong, and which white and black persons here who stood by me through the war can contradict. Go to work, be industrious, live honestly, and act truly. And when you are oppressed, I'll come to your relief.
The speech went over stupendously, and as the crowd erupted in acclamation, one African-American woman gave the old general a bouquet of roses and a peck on the cheek.
Yeah, he said that toward the end of Reconstruction, after the Klan's goal of reestablishing the antebellum social order had been accomplished.
Yep.
Southern Democrats were back in power at that point, and Forrest could afford to be magnanimous. I think his message here, though presented in a very nice and friendly way, was work hard, stay in your lane.
Stay in your place.
And
Yep.
we won't have a problem.
That's exactly right. Stay in your place, know your place, black people, and we'll get along just fine. You be the laborers, you be the lowly second-class citizens, and we'll be good. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I'm going to wrap it up right there. I think that's a lot to take in. We'll come back tomorrow with part 2 of this. A mixed bag. There's some things I disagreed with, but by and large, I understand where he's coming from, and I think he's made some very solid points. Let me know what you think. Use the comment section below. If you want to see the original video, I've put a link in the description. Make sure you check them out. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but I think it's a great resource for understanding some of the arguments on both sides, and so for that, I applaud him for that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.